In seminary, in our classes on homiletics, which is really a fancy word for preaching, and they teach you how to construct a sermon. One of the things that we learn to do is to go through the various scriptures that you're going to preach on and break each sentence down into key words and then further refine it into other key words and see how those words have been used in the past or by others in commentary. And a word stuck out at me today, or this week rather, that hadn't really stuck out at me before. And it doesn't make any difference whether it's original with me or not. It's what you're going to get, because it's the word that really stuck out with me out of this passage. I could well have preached about the glowing white and a lot of other subjects, the astonishment and maybe even the fear, but the word silent hit me. They remained silent. It says they kept their silence. Well, you know, silence, they say, is gold. And I want to talk a little bit about silence this morning. I read about an unusual protest in a convent in New Jersey some time ago, and there were 4 of the younger nuns who had locked themselves into a tiny little room on the second floor of their infirmary, and they vowed to take a vow of near silence. They were protesting. They had a new prioress at the convent, and she had introduced what they thought were some worldly, secular things. She had introduced television, secular videos, recorded music, bright lights, and even a ration of daily sweets was introduced into the convent. And so they were protesting these new rules, and they said this new prioress was trying to turn their convent into nothing but a big party. So in order to express their revulsion to these ungodly changes in their convent, these 4 sisters locked themselves away. You know, I kind of envy them. There are times I feel like locking myself away. There are times that I look out and I see so much that happens in this old world of ours that is distressing, that I too would like to withdraw and let the world go on. Simon Peter wanted to build 3 booths or dwellings or houses, as you were, and stay on the mountaintop. He didn't want to go down. He wanted to be there on that Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus and Moses and Elijah and James and John. But you know, he was not given that option to stay or not to stay. And you and I really are not given that option either. We have to live in the world as strife and discord of noise, just as it is. There is no retreat. There seems to be no escape from the noise of our society and the things that can be troubling. Wouldn't it be nice, though, just every once in a while, to experience what James and John and Peter experienced on that mountain of transfiguration. They'd gone away to this secluded spot for prayer with the Master, and it's not very likely that they were at all prepared for what they were going to see and what was going to happen. You know, it's kind of interesting to note, if you think about James, John, and Peter going away with Jesus, it's recorded in the scriptures that they went away with him on two different occasions to very special occurrences and very special events. And they went to sleep both times. They went to sleep in Gethsemane when Jesus' life was in peril. And then they go to sleep up on the mountain of Transfiguration, where one of the greatest experiences of all time history was to take place. You see, when they got there and they saw what there was to see, there was something that was going to happen that no one would ever forget. They were not only in the presence of Jesus, but they were in presence with the most significant figures of the Old Testament, of the Bible. Moses, who represented the law, and Elijah, who represented the prophets. You can imagine how, as one of those three disciples, how stunned you would become. And Peter spoke up, as Peter always did, even though he was stunned. And he said, "Master, it is well that we are here. Let us make those three dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Good old Simon Peter, he can always be counted on to put his 2 cents worth in. And about this time, when he spoke up, a cloud came down and circled them. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of being high on a mountain or even high on a hill when the clouds get low and you really are encircled by the clouds. Well, that was the experience that they had. And then, in the middle of that cloud that was encircling them, they heard a voice. That voice said, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." Listen to him. And when the voice spoke, the cloud dispersed, and Moses and Elijah were gone, and Jesus was left there in silence with his 3 disciples. And he told the disciples to keep silent until no one what you have seen. Well, what were they to say? Jesus says, remain silent. And maybe it's because there are some experiences for which words are absolutely inadequate. How can words express how you feel when you take hold of that newborn babe for the very first time? What are the words that are adequate to speak to somebody who has just lost a loved one, a life's partner? What can you say to somebody when you have been in the presence of the living God? Silence sometimes is the most appropriate response. You see, Luke tells us the disciples kept silent. And that was an appropriate response. We can learn from what a man by the name of Ralph Harper writes. He says, we know that serious things have to be done in silence. In silence, men love, men pray, men listen, men compose, men write, people think, and yes, they even suffer in silence. And many of us are afraid of silence. I think St. Peter was one. We go uncomfortable as the conversation begins to draw down and silence begins to take its place. But there are occasions that really do demand silence. Let me give you a couple of examples. Silence may be the best response when we're in the presence of a mystery that is simply too great for our understanding. You see, that was the disciples' situation. They were in the middle of a mystery that was far too great for their understanding. They could not comprehend. So James and John had sense enough to keep silent. But good old Peter, not knowing what to say but feeling like something had to be said, he said it. He said, maybe we ought to build these 3 houses and you guys just stay here and don't ever leave. Well, we may not want to admit it, but there are mysteries that demand silence. And sometimes the mystery of suffering is one of those. John Claypool wrote an interesting book called The Light Within You. And in this book, Claypool relates a very painful story. It's the story of his own young daughter, who he lost to the disease of leukemia. And very quickly upon diagnosis of the disease, the little girl was given some kind of medicine, and it seemed to have an immediate effect, and she seemed to get better. Could it be an answer to their prayers? Could it be a miracle? But it was not to be. It was not an example at that time of divine healing. All of these hopes came to an abrupt end on one Sunday morning, interestingly enough, on a Easter Sunday morning, when the pains returned to this little girl, and they had to return her to the hospital. And during 2 weeks of hospitalization, she suffered mightily. And her daddy reported that moving through that 2 weeks of pain and suffering experience with her was draining. But the worst moment came on one night. On that night, his daughter could just absolutely get no relief from the pain. And she asked him, when will the leukemia go away? He answered her, I know how painful it is, darling. We're doing the best we can. The doctors are trying to help you and trying to find a cure. There was a long silence, and then the little girl asked in the darkened hospital room, have you asked God when the leukemia will go away? And her father, pastor part, hedged just a little bit and said, you know, darling, we have prayed and we have prayed and we have prayed and we have asked for God to help us. But she persisted. Have you asked God when it will go away? Well, what could he say? And he asks the question, how do you respond to such a childlike directness at a time when the heavens seem to be utterly silent? There are some questions without an answer. And when a pastor comes to visit you in a home or in a hospital or in a funeral home, in an hour in which you have experienced a great tragedy, please don't expect him or her to come with a lot of glib, ready-made answers. They will sit with you. They will struggle with you. They will pray with you. And I hope in my case, I will restrain myself from ever giving any pat, ready-made, simple answers. Because some questions simply have no answers. Such times demand a measure of silence. You see, we can wait on the Lord and we can trust that through him we will see, even though we see a glass darkly, one day we will see him face to face. Give you another example that is a good idea to remain silent. It is the best response when we are in the presence of something or someone greater than ourselves. Can you see Peter, James, and John as they contemplated what it meant to be in the presence not only of Jesus, but Moses and Elijah? And then to top all of that off, to hear the voice of God. Wow, what an experience. What could you say? No wonder they were silent. Here was dust meeting divinity. The temporal in the presence meeting the eternal. The imperfect being face to face with the holiest of the holies. How great it would be if we could have such experiences today, where in our silence we could truly experience the holiest of the holies. And experiences like that demand silence. And in silence there is power. Because in their silence, the disciples heard the most powerful thing that has ever existed. The voice of God. Try to put yourself in God's place when it comes to prayer. It must be frustrating for God to hear many of us, myself included, as we pray, seeking his guidance, telling him we need his help, and then we do all the talking. Suppose you had a friend that every time you sat down with, they did all the talking. Never listened to you. It'd get a little frustrating, wouldn't it? Yet so often we make our requests from God, and then we just keep going on and on and on instead of shutting up and listening. God, poor fellow, doesn't have a chance to give us any kind of return on what we're asking. You see, there is a time for silence, and there's a time for shutting out all of the conflicting noise that we may have to allow us to think about what is most important in our life. There is a time to stop talking and to listen. So maybe those 4 young nuns in New Jersey were on to something. Maybe we should all just lock ourselves away sometime, not in protest, but in prayer, to listen in silence. Peter, James, and John were silent when they heard the voice of God. And God spoke and he said, "This is my Son, my chosen one. Listen to him." That's a good idea. I want to suggest that maybe our prayers should simply ask God for help to listen to him so that we can hear. And that maybe in our prayer we say something like this: "Oh Lord, I am listening. What do you have to say to me?"